During their vacation, the family faces pressure from the police, but the officers don't yet know who will stand in their way. Subscribe. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The winding road into the Rockies stretched out before them, climbing higher with each mile until the air itself seemed lighter, sharper. Chosen for its seclusion, the mountain resort sat tucked away between towering pines and sheer cliffs, a place where the world promised to slow down. For Chuck Norris, the thought of leaving behind schedules, film obligations, and public appearances was almost as refreshing as the crisp alpine breeze spilling in through the cracked window of the SUV. Beside him, Gina was gazing out at the mountains, their jagged silhouettes softened by a haze of morning light. In the back seat, their twins, Dakota and Dana Lee, leaned toward their respective windows, marveling at the endless green walls of forest climbing into the sky. Chuck had made a point of keeping this trip quiet. No photographers, no personal security tailing them, no press releases. It was a gift for his family. Days with no interruptions, no one asking for autographs while they tried to have dinner, no film crew schedules to navigate. They would check into the lodge, follow their own timetable, and enjoy the sort of simple pleasures he remembered from his own childhood walks under open skies, evenings by a fire, and the kind of conversations that happened only when no one was watching the clock. The resort appeared almost suddenly, nestled into a plateau with an uninterrupted view of a deep, sparkling valley. Constructed from heavy stone and weathered cedar, it had the look of something that belonged to the mountains rather than imposed on them. A long, glass-fronted lobby overlooked the drop toward the lake far below, and the scent of wood smoke drifted faintly on the wind. Chuck pulled into the guest parking area and cut the engine, letting the sudden quiet wash over them. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine, and somewhere in the distance, the muffled rush of a waterfall. Inside, check-in was quick but formal. Chuck noted the way the front desk clerk's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, as if trying to place his face. When the man asked for identification, Chuck offered it with a polite smile, keeping his tone friendly but his mind alert. He had learned long ago that first impressions told you much about a place. The staff were courteous enough, but there was a formality in their demeanor, a careful choice of words that made him wonder whether it was politeness or distance. He took the key cards, thanked the clerk, and led his family toward the elevators. Their suite was spacious, with a wall of glass that opened onto a balcony overlooking the valley. The air that poured in was cool and clean, carrying the resinous scent of pine. The twins ran from room to room, choosing beds and testing the firmness of the sofa cushions. Gina wandered to the balcony, resting her hands on the railing and taking in the view. Chuck moved through the space in a different way, noting the location of doors and windows, the direction the locks turned, the distance from their room to the nearest stairwell. Old habits, instincts from years of service and a lifetime of training made these observations automatic. He didn't feel unsafe exactly, but he believed in being prepared. The first morning set the rhythm for their days. Chuck rose before dawn, quietly slipping into running shoes and heading out into the pale half-light. He followed a gravel trail that wound through the trees and opened onto a meadow still silvered with dew. The cold air burned his lungs in the most invigorating way, and by the time he returned, the sky had gone from lavender to blue. Outside on the grass beside the lodge, he led Dakota and Dana Lee through a light warm-up. He kept it simple: stretching, breathing exercises, balance drills. Then he showed them a few movements, stances, and footwork, reminding them that discipline was the foundation of strength. He told them, as he had many times, that a true martial artist used their skills to avoid conflict whenever possible. A win, he said, was walking away with your family safe and your conscience clear. After breakfast, they explored the resort. The architecture blended into the landscape, stone paths winding between stands of aspen and spruce. A multi-level pool complex occupied the southern edge, cascading from an upper infinity pool down to a family area, with a waterfall that fed a shallow basin for children. Beyond that, glass panels framed a view of the distant lake, its surface catching the sun like molten silver. Chuck made mental notes as they walked. The placement of safety equipment, the exits, even the location of service doors marked staff only. It was in the subtle details that he sensed something else about the place. The staff maintained a polished courtesy, but there were glances quick, assessing that passed between some of them. The security cameras were positioned oddly, leaving obvious gaps in coverage, and now and then, as they passed other guests, Chuck caught the faint shift in tone that came when people paused mid-conversation until they had walked by. Gina noticed too. On their way back from the pool, she mentioned how certain guests had stepped aside in a way that felt more deliberate than polite. Chuck didn't dismiss it, but he filed it away for later, preferring not to cloud the first day with speculation. They spent the afternoon in the game lounge, where the twins challenged each other over a battered foosball table, and later took a short hike along a marked trail. In the evening, the family settled into the suite's living area. A fire crackled in the hearth as they played a board game, the golden light warming Gina's face and reflecting in the children's eyes. It was exactly what Chuck had hoped for. No interruptions, no urgency, just the simple comfort of being together. Yet even in this ease, his attention drifted now and then to the glass balcony doors in the view beyond. From up here, he could see the pool complex below, the water lit from within in shifting shades of turquoise. A few guests still lingered at its edge, though the air had cooled. Near one of the glass panels that bordered the pool deck, a man in a dark jacket stood apart. Not swimming, not seated, just watching. The man raised a phone, angled it toward the deck, and took several photos before turning and walking toward a staff entrance. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. The door shut behind the man, and the moment passed, but the image stayed with him. Later, as they prepared for bed, Gina mentioned that she had noticed the same figure earlier in the day, loitering near the shallow pool while the twins played. She wasn't sure why it had struck her as odd at the time, but now the memory unsettled her. Chuck reassured her without dismissing her concern, saying they would keep their eyes open. Still, he lay awake longer than usual, listening to the soft breathing of his family, the muted hiss of wind against the windows. He had come here for peace, but his instincts told him to be ready. The mountains might be silent at night, but silence had never meant the absence of danger. The next morning they rose with the sun. As he led the twins through another round of warm-ups on the grass, Chuck felt the eyes of a few early risers on them from the terrace above. He ignored it outwardly, focusing on his children's movements, but part of his attention measured the weight of those stares. They were on vacation, yes, but he knew from experience that trouble had a way of finding you when you least expected it. And in a place like this, with its hidden corners and careful formality, he wondered whether it might already be moving toward them. The second morning broke crisp and clear, the early light scattering across the peaks like shards of pale gold. Chuck had woken before the alarm, as he always did, moving quietly around the suite so as not to disturb the rest of the family. He had plans for the day, a short hike along one of the ridges, maybe a drive down into the small town in the valley to visit its general store, and later, an afternoon by the fire with nothing more pressing than a book in hand. Gina was gathering towels and sunscreen for a quick swim with the twins before breakfast. It was the kind of harmless, relaxed start he wanted for them. When she asked if he was coming along, he shook his head with a smile, telling her he needed to finish arranging their reservation for a guided mountain trek. He assured her he would join them in less than an hour. Gina and the children left together, their voices fading down the hallway, leaving him in the sudden quiet of the suite. He took the opportunity to double-check the details of their upcoming hike, calling the outfitter to confirm their guides, equipment, and the safest route for the kids. The call took longer than expected. He pressed for information about weather changes in the area and any recent wildlife activity near the trails. By the time he hung up, he realized 20 minutes had slipped away. He considered heading down to the pool to meet them, but decided to finish a few quick stretches first. It was only when he stepped out onto the balcony for a breath of fresh air that he caught sight of movement below. From his vantage point, the pool area looked serene. The water sparkled under the morning sun, steam lifting from the heated surface. Gina and the twins were near the shallow end, Dakota splashing, while Danilee practiced a handstand in the water. At first it was a scene of simple joy. Then two figures entered from the far gate, uniforms dark against the bright pool deck. Their presence was immediately out of place. Police officers at a private resort were not a common sight, and certainly not poolside. They walked with a purposeful, unhurried stride, scanning the guests as they passed. Chuck's eyes narrowed as they reached his family. The shorter of the two, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and an unyielding set to his jaw, spoke first. He gestured toward Gina and then toward her wristband, his expression neutral but edged with something sharper. The younger officer, broad-shouldered and restless, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if itching for an excuse to act. Chuck couldn't hear their words from this distance, but he didn't need to. The body language was enough. Gina, still in the water up to her waist, glanced toward the twins, guiding them closer to the edge where she stood. She reached for her bag and pulled out the key card to their suite, showing it to the older officer. He looked at it briefly, then said something to his partner. The younger man stepped closer to her than necessary, his shadow falling across the children. Chuck's instincts sharpened. He left the balcony at once, moving quickly through the suite and down the hallway to the elevator. The descent felt slower than usual, each floor passing with a muted chime that grated against his impatience. When the doors opened to the lobby, he crossed it with measured steps, scanning for any sign of security staff. None were in sight. The glass doors leading to the pool swung open at his push, the scent of chlorine and sun-warmed stone meeting him as he stepped onto the deck. By then, the conversation had drawn the attention of several other guests. A pair of retirees and loungers watched openly. A young couple nearby glanced up from their phones, their expressions tight with curiosity. Gina stood now with the twins just behind her, the three of them forming a small, tense cluster at the pool's edge. The older officer held her key card loosely, as if debating whether to return it. The younger one leaned slightly forward, hands on his hips, in a stance meant to project authority. Chuck closed the distance without raising his voice or quickening his pace. His presence alone shifted the focus. The older officer turned first, eyes narrowing as a recognition flickered, or perhaps only the recognition of a man who would not be easy to intimidate. Chuck stopped at a polite distance, his gaze sweeping briefly over both men before settling on Gina. She handed him a small, tight smile, the kind that said she was holding her composure for the children's sake. The officer returned the keycard without comment. Chuck accepted it and, without breaking eye contact, placed a light hand on Gina's shoulder, subtly moving her and the twins a step back. He asked no questions. He didn't need to. The point had been made, and everyone on the deck could see it. Whatever pretext the officers had used to approach them, They had found nothing, but the message was clear. They could intrude at will. The rest of the swim was brief. Gina suggested heading back upstairs, and the twins didn't protest, sensing the undercurrent of unease. Chuck walked with them, keeping his body between them and the two officers, who now stood near the pool gate, watching their departure. He felt their eyes on his back until the door to the building closed behind them. In the elevator, the twins asked no questions, though Dakota cast a puzzled glance at his father. Back in the suite, Gina set the towels to dry and went into the bedroom to change, moving with the restless energy of someone replaying an unwelcome encounter. Chuck remained in the living area, watching the mountains through the glass, his mind turning over the details. The officer's presence was not routine, not here. Their approach had been selective, and their demeanor suggested more than casual curiosity. That evening, small inconveniences began to surface. When they went down to dinner, their reservation could not be found in the system, though Gina had made it earlier in the day. The hostess, polite but firm, explained they would need to wait until a table opened. In the restaurant, service to their table lagged noticeably behind others. Their server's smile stretched thin. Returning to the suite afterward, they found the electronic lock slow to respond to their key cards, the green light blinking only after several tries. On the carpet just inside the door lay a folded piece of paper. Gina picked it up and unfolded it to find a short, anonymous message scrawled in block letters. "Stay in your place." She said nothing at first, only held it out for Chuck to read. His jaw tightened, but he tucked the note into his pocket without comment. Later, as the twins got ready for bed, a fire alarm sounded suddenly in the hallway, its piercing tone cutting through the quiet. They stepped into the corridor to find several other guests milling about in confusion. Within minutes, a member of the staff announced it was a false alarm, a technical glitch in the system. Chuck noticed the same two officers from the pool standing at the far end of the hall, speaking with a security guard. They didn't look in his direction, but he was certain they knew he had seen them. Back inside the suite, Gina closed the curtains and checked the balcony door twice. Chuck moved to the desk and began writing down times, locations, and descriptions from the day, the beginning of a record he intended to keep. He explained to Gina, in low tones so the children wouldn't overhear, that they would stick to clear, well-trafficked areas of the resort, vary their routes between locations, and establish simple signals for the twins to use if they felt uneasy or needed him quickly. She agreed without hesitation. By the time the lights were out, the resort seemed to have returned to its usual stillness, but Chuck knew better than to take that at face value. The pattern had begun. Small tests, calculated to unsettle. They had marked his family as a target for reasons he did not yet understand. And as he lay awake in the dark, listening to the soft rhythm of his children's breathing, he resolved that if they thought intimidation would drive the Norrises into submission, they had chosen the wrong family. The morning after the fire alarm incident brought with it a muted tension that seemed to cling to the air, as though the resort itself were holding its breath. Chuck awoke early, his internal clock rousing him before the pale blue of dawn had given way to the sun. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of the twins shifting in their sleep and the faint creak of the wooden beams settling above. He moved silently into the living area, pulled on his training clothes, and stepped out onto the balcony. The mountains stood immutable in the distance, but down below, on the service paths between buildings, there was movement far earlier than he would have expected. Two men in uniforms that didn't quite match the resort's standard livery walked toward the maintenance shed, pausing occasionally to glance around. One carried a clipboard, the other nothing at all, but both moved with a wariness that struck him as practiced rather than casual. By the time Gina and the twins joined him for breakfast in the dining room, he had already decided that what they were experiencing was more than a series of coincidences. He didn't voice it directly. There was no need to burden the children with unease. Instead, he watched. The servers moved efficiently, but the moment his family sat down, he noticed a change in the room's undercurrent. Conversations paused. Glances were exchanged. At a table near the wall, a man he recognized from the day before. The one who had loitered by the staff door near the pool sat, alone with a coffee, pretending to read a newspaper. Every few minutes, he would turn a page without looking at it, his eyes flicking up toward their table. After breakfast, Chuck suggested a walk around the property. He framed it as an exploration for the twins, but in truth it was reconnaissance. The resort was a labyrinth of manicured pathways, service alleys, and connecting corridors. Some areas were bustling with guests, others oddly deserted. He noted the placement of security cameras and the gaps between them. Gaps so obvious they could not be accidental. One such blind spot was a stretch of the pool deck where the incident with the officers had occurred. Another was along the parking terrace near the staff entrance. These spaces seemed to invite situations that could later be denied or left unrecorded. It was in one of these less frequented areas, near the back of the laundry facility, that he met a man pushing a cart stacked with fresh linens. The man's face was lined, his eyes quick but cautious. Chuck greeted him with a polite nod, slowing his pace just enough to give the man a chance to speak if he chose. At first, he received only a wary glance, but then, as if making a decision, the man murmured that he had seen what happened at the pool. He didn't elaborate, only added that this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened here. His tone was low, his gaze darting toward a nearby camera before he corrected himself. "Not here," he said, "around here," and moved on. It wasn't a confession, but it was a crack in the wall of silence. Later, from the balcony of their suite, Chuck observed the same two officers who had confronted Gina and the twins. They approached the resort's manager, a woman named Karen Foster, in the main courtyard. She greeted them not with the distant professionalism one might expect toward law enforcement, but with the familiarity of regular interaction. They spoke briefly before she led them toward a side entrance that required a key card. Minutes later, all three emerged smiling, the officers carrying envelopes that they tucked away as they departed. The exchange was brief, but it was all the confirmation Chuck needed that the connection between them was more than passing acquaintance. That afternoon brought more subtle disruptions. The reservation Gina had made for a spa session was inexplicably canceled, and the children's names had been omitted from the sign-up sheet for the craft workshop they'd been looking forward to. The explanations were always the same: clerical errors, mix-ups, apologies. Yet they always resulted in the family being displaced from planned activities and left to linger in public areas where they were more exposed. Even the parking space they had been assigned on arrival had been reassigned, forcing them to park farther from their building in a dimly lit section of the lot. In the evening, Chuck took a slow walk to the lower levels of the main building, where the service corridors connected the kitchen, laundry, and maintenance areas. These halls were narrow with peeling paint and the smell of detergent hanging in the air. Workers passed him with nods or avoided eye contact altogether. He paused at one corner to listen. Somewhere ahead, voices were murmuring, low and deliberate. He recognized Karen Foster's clipped speech and a man's voice that could only belong to one of the officers, its confidence and tone unchanged since the poolside encounter. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakably transactional, a series of short questions and answers, punctuated by the shuffle of paper. Returning to the suite, he found Gina sitting at the dining table, her laptop open. She had begun keeping her own notes, times, dates, names, mirroring his meticulous record. The twins were sprawled on the couch watching a movie, seemingly oblivious, though Dakota cast a quick glance toward his parents now and then. Gina spoke quietly, telling him that an elderly woman in the elevator had whispered, "Be careful," before stepping off without another word. They didn't know if it was a warning about the resort or something else, but the weight in her voice told him she felt it was connected. That night, the tension settled over the suite like a second skin. Chuck reviewed his observations, matching them against the incidents from the past 2 days. The pattern was emerging: targeted disruptions to their plans, isolation from activities, encounters with specific individuals in unmonitored areas, and the repeated presence of the same law enforcement officers in places they had no obvious reason to be. It was not random, it was calculated. He rose before dawn again the next day, slipping out while the rest of the family slept. This time he moved through the resort with a deliberate route in mind, passing through public areas and cutting into service zones where he knew the cameras were absent. He saw the older officer, Marks, leaning against a wall near the maintenance shed, speaking with a stocky man in plain clothes. As Chuck passed within earshot, their conversation fell silent. The stocky man's gaze followed him until he rounded the corner. By the time he returned to the suite, the sun had climbed over the ridge, flooding the room with light. The twins were at the table, eating breakfast while Gina packed a small bag for a hike. They smiled at him, eager for the day's outing, and he returned it, hiding the thoughts that were forming in his mind. Whatever network operated here, it was confident enough to act in the open, certain that guests would either leave quietly or accept whatever treatment was given. That confidence was a vulnerability, and Chuck knew how to use vulnerabilities. But for now, he kept his focus on the family. The day would be theirs, but his eyes would remain open, watching for the next thread to pull. He could feel it in the air. The web around them was tightening, but every web had a center, and once he found it, he could break it apart. The hike the family took that morning began like any other, with the pale gold of sunlight spilling over the mountain ridges and the sharp scent of pine lingering in the cool air. Chuck set a pace that was gentle enough for the twins, but deliberate enough to take them deeper into the network of trails that crisscrossed the hills above the resort. It was meant to be a distraction, a way to give the kids a memory that wasn't laced with unease. Yet even here, where the chatter of guests and the hum of resort machinery faded into silence, his mind worked like a clock, turning over the details of the past days. He had seen enough patterns in his life, on the streets, in competition, during his time in the military, to know that what they were caught in wasn't a coincidence. It was a campaign. They returned to the resort just before midday, cheeks flushed from the climb, and were met with a sight that set the day on a different course. 2 uniformed officers stood in the main courtyard, and even from a distance Chuck recognized them. Officer Marks, with his heavy-set build and that permanent sneer curling one corner of his mouth, and Officer Duran, leaner but with a sharpness in his eyes that suggested he enjoyed pushing boundaries. Both were engaged in a quiet conversation with Karen Foster. This time, there was no attempt to hide the interaction. Foster's arms were folded, her stance confident, as if this meeting were part of her daily schedule. When her gaze lifted and landed on Chuck and his family, she didn't flinch or look away. Instead, a thin smile crossed her face before she turned back to the officers. They were in the lobby less than an hour later when the first confrontation happened. Gina had taken the twins to the gift shop while Chuck stopped at the front desk to confirm their dinner reservation. Marks approached, his voice booming across the lobby under the guise of friendly concern. But every word had an edge. He asked where Chuck had been that morning, whether he'd left the property, whether he'd seen anything interesting on his hike. The questions were casual on the surface, but weighted underneath, each one a probe for information or a reaction. Chuck kept his answers short, his tone neutral, his body relaxed. Years of martial arts had taught him the value of posture in both combat and conversation. Later that afternoon, the pressure shifted to Gina. She had taken the twins to the pool, hoping to give them an easy few hours in the sun. Chuck had been in their suite, reviewing some of the notes they gathered, when his phone buzzed with a message from Gina. "They're here." By the time he reached the pool deck, Duran was standing near their loungers, speaking to Gina with that calculated blend of authority and condescension. The twins were in the shallow end, glancing nervously toward their mother. Chuck's arrival changed Duran's tone instantly. He stepped back, muttered something about just checking on guest safety, and left. But the message was clear. They could reach his family at any time. The rest of the day unfolded with small, needling intrusions. A server accidentally spilled a drink near their table at lunch, splashing Gina's dress. Their key cards inexplicably stopped working, forcing them to stand in the lobby while a clerk sorted the system. At one point, the twins' bikes, which had been left neatly outside their building, were moved to the far side of the property. None of it was overtly threatening, but it was designed to chip away at comfort, to keep them on edge. Chuck knew these tactics. He'd seen them in tournament psychology, in military training, in the way predators tested boundaries before striking. That evening, while the twins were absorbed in a board game and Gina was in the shower, Chuck slipped out for a walk under the pretense of grabbing ice. Instead, he made his way toward the southern edge of the resort, where the maintenance road dipped out of sight from the main buildings. There, half hidden by a row of storage sheds, he spotted Marks again, this time in conversation with two men in civilian clothes. One handed him a small flat object that glinted briefly in the fading light before disappearing into the officer's jacket. Chuck lingered just long enough to note the men's faces, then continued on without being seen. Back in the suite, he found Gina waiting at the table. Her expression told him she'd been thinking about more than the day's inconveniences. She'd started making a list of every incident since their arrival, every misplaced item, every strange look, every unexplained cancellation. She handed it to him, and together they went over each entry. It was no longer a scattered series of frustrations. It was a pattern, deliberate and coordinated. The next morning, Chuck decided to draw his own line in the sand. He kept the family close, ensuring they were always together in public spaces. At breakfast, when Duran lingered nearby, Chuck met his gaze directly and didn't look away until the officer shifted uncomfortably and left. At the pool, when Marks appeared on the upper deck, Chuck's stance alone, calm but solid, with a readiness that was impossible to miss, was enough to keep him at a distance. It wasn't a show of aggression, but it was a statement. They were not an easy target. Still, the day ended with another intrusion, this one sharper than the rest. Returning from dinner, they found the door to their suite ajar. Nothing appeared to be missing, but items had been moved subtle changes, just enough for them to notice. A jacket draped differently over a chair. The twin stuffed animals arranged in a slightly different order on the bed. It was a message without words. We can be inside your world whenever we choose. That night, as the family settled uneasily to sleep, Chuck sat in the darkened living area, watching the mountains through the glass. He wasn't afraid. They had underestimated him, but he was certain of one thing. The next move would have to be his. The web they had spun was meant to control him through his family. That was their mistake. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of turning an opponent's aggression into their downfall, And now, for the first time since their arrival, he felt the shift begin. The lines had been drawn, and he intended to cross theirs before they could cross his again. Morning broke with the same soft light filtering through the mountain haze, but the atmosphere inside the suite felt heavier than the air outside. The ajar door from the night before had left an invisible mark, the kind that seeps into every glance and pause. Gina moved quietly through the kitchen area, preparing breakfast for the twins without her usual chatter, while Chuck sat at the table, his coffee untouched, eyes focused on the horizon beyond the balcony. He was listening, as he always did in situations like this, not just to sounds but to the absences of them, the changes in rhythm that meant something was different. The twins sensed it too. They stayed closer to their parents that morning, no playful dashes down the hallway, no lingering in the lobby to look at the tourist brochures. Chuck didn't need to tell them to stay close. They understood. It was a kind of unspoken awareness. And while he hated that they were being drawn into this tension, he was quietly proud of how naturally they adapted. Discipline wasn't only for the dojo. It was for moments like this, when the real world demanded the same focus as a fight. He had a plan to act on that day, but like any tactician, he needed the right moment. For now, his role was observation. After breakfast, they walked the grounds together. Chuck noticed how the same faces kept appearing. A man in a groundskeeper's uniform who seemed to be raking the same patch of gravel every time they passed. A woman in housekeeping attire who lingered in the hallway without a cart. These weren't hotel staff going about their work. These were lookouts, part of a watch designed to map his movements and measure his reactions. It was confirmation of what he'd already suspected. They were being watched on every path they took. By midday, the overt harassment began again. Marks intercepted them near the tennis courts, this time not bothering with casual small talk. His questions came sharp and direct, framed in the language of guest safety checks, but it was clear he was fishing for something, an admission, a slip, anything he could twist into justification. Chuck answered with calm precision, giving nothing more than was needed. The martial artist in him knew that overextension was the fastest way to create an opening, and he wasn't about to give them one. Later, while Gina took the twins to the game room, Chuck made his way to the far edge of the property under the pretense of visiting the fitness center. Instead, he slipped through a service corridor and emerged near the staff parking lot. That's where he saw Duran leaning against an unmarked SUV, talking to a man in a dark jacket. The conversation was brief, but the exchange of a small object too quick to identify wasn't lost on him. He committed the man's face to memory. One of the many lessons from his Air Force days was that details like these, small and seemingly insignificant, could unravel an entire network when the time came. Back at the suite, the family regrouped for lunch. Gina's unease was plain. She'd noticed a pair of resort employees watching the twins in the game room. They hadn't approached, but their focus had been too fixed to be innocent. Chuck reassured her without making promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he spoke in the language they'd both come to understand over the years. Quiet, deliberate confidence, the kind that told her he was in control of the situation, even if the timing for action wasn't quite right yet. The day's turning point came in the late afternoon. A handwritten note was slid under their door while they were inside. There was no signature, just a time, 9 p.m., and a location. The old service complex on the far side of the property. It was an invitation, but not one meant for conversation. Chuck studied the handwriting, the choice of location. It was isolated, poorly lit, and mostly unused. A place where no guest would wander, where cameras might be conveniently offline. It was, in every sense, a trap. Gina saw the note and shook her head immediately. knowing the danger it implied. But Chuck was already working through the possibilities. This was what they had been building toward, not just intimidation, but a decisive move to scare him off or remove him entirely. And that meant whoever showed up would be confident, perhaps overconfident. In the world of combat, overconfidence was the lever you used to flip an opponent onto their back. He spent the early evening preparing, though not in the way most people would imagine. There was no loading of weapons or dramatic gearing up. His preparation was mental and physical stretching routines to keep his movements fluid, controlled breathing to keep his pulse steady, visualization of the space and possible points of entry and exit. Every scenario played out in his head before the first step was taken. When the time came, he left the suite without fanfare, telling Gina only to keep the door locked and the twins inside until he returned. The walk to the service complex was deliberate but unhurried. He kept to the shadows where possible, not to hide from whoever might be watching, but to deny them a clear read on his approach. The air grew cooler as he moved farther from the main resort, the sounds of music and conversation fading until only the crunch of gravel underfoot remained. The building itself loomed in the dark, its corrugated walls catching just enough moonlight to give them a dull metallic sheen. One of the side doors stood slightly open, a single line of light spilling out onto the ground. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and dust. Shadows shifted at the far end of the room. 3 figures, not 2. Marks and Duran were there, flanking a third man Chuck didn't recognize, but whose posture spoke of authority. This wasn't just a test of intimidation. This was a meeting with someone higher up the chain. They spoke first, their words edged with threat and confidence, but Chuck barely heard them. He was reading the room, noting the positions, the distance between them, the objects that could serve as cover or tools, a stack of crates to the left, a steel support beam in the center, a coiled extension cord on the floor. Every detail was cataloged. When Mark stepped forward, closing the space between them, Chuck knew the opening had come. The trap had been set, but not for him, for them. He didn't strike first. He let the officer's hand brush his shoulder, a gesture meant to assert control, and in that fraction of a second, he moved. A shift of balance, a grip on the wrist, a twist that redirected Marks's weight into the beam. Duran advanced, but Chuck was already pivoting, using the momentum of the first takedown to position himself for the second. The third man didn't move yet, but his hand hovered near his jacket, and Chuck's eyes tracked it without losing awareness of the others. It was over in moments. The training that had taken decades to perfect did exactly what it was meant to. Neutralize the threat without unnecessary damage, control the space, and leave no opportunity for escalation. When Chuck stepped back, all 3 men were either on the ground or too stunned to act. He left them there, their own overconfidence having undone them, and walked back into the night. By the time he reached the suite, the weight in the air had shifted again. Gina met him at the door, reading the outcome in his eyes before he spoke a word. The trap had failed, but the fight wasn't over. If anything, the failure would make their opponents more desperate, and desperate enemies were the most dangerous kind. Chuck knew the next move had to be his, and it had to end this, once and for all. The morning after the confrontation in the service complex broke cold and sharp, as if the mountain air had been cleansed overnight. Yet for Chuck, the clarity outside was at odds with the turbulence he felt inside. He had exposed the core of the threat marks, Duran, and the man who stood behind them, but exposure was only the first step. The kind of rot he had glimpsed didn't end with a few bruised egos. It spread deeper, tangled in networks of influence and money. If he left it at this, The danger to his family might retreat for a time, but it would never truly disappear. He had learned long ago, both in uniform and in the ring, that half measures were invitations for trouble to come back stronger. Gina noticed the tension in him over breakfast. She didn't press for details. She had been with him long enough to know when his mind was in the place between decision and action. The twins, sensing the undercurrent, were quieter than usual, stealing glances at their father as though trying to gauge what was coming. Chuck forced himself to smile at them, to be present in that moment, because he knew soon he would have to step away again. Not for long, but long enough to bring this to a close. He began his preparations with the same discipline he had carried through every mission in his life. First came information. The night before, in the seconds after the takedown, he had noted key details: the model and plates of the SUV, the face of the third man, the way Marks had referred to him as Mr. Klene. It wasn't much, but in skilled hands even fragments could unravel an operation. Chuck made a call to an old friend from his Air Force days, now in a position within federal law enforcement. He didn't give names over the phone, just enough to spark interest and prompt a discreet background check. He knew the friend would understand the stakes without needing the full story. By midday, Chuck had what he needed. Klene was no ordinary businessman. He had a record of consulting contracts with local municipalities, ownership of several shell companies, and an unbroken chain of ties to both the resort and the county sheriff's office. He wasn't just bankrolling Marks and Duran, he was the keystone holding the structure together. If Klene fell, the rest would crumble. The question was how to bring him down without putting Gina and the twins in the line of fire. Direct confrontation had served its purpose with the enforcers, but Klene was a different type of adversary. Men like him feared exposure more than fists. Chuck decided the final blow would have to come in the form of light, undeniable, public light. That meant evidence, and evidence meant going back into the places where these men operated without expecting him. Under cover of evening, he left the suite again, this time carrying only a small camera, a digital recorder, and the same quiet confidence that had carried him through countless dangerous assignments. He moved like a shadow through the service corridors, slipping past staff who didn't even register his presence. In a locked office adjoining the main administration wing, he found what he expected: files, receipts, correspondence linking Klene to illegal seizures of guest property, coercion of local businesses, and agreements that funneled illicit earnings through the resort's accounts. He photographed everything methodically, making sure to capture dates, signatures, and the web of connections. He didn't take a single document. Removing evidence would tip their hand too soon. As he worked, he heard voices in the hallway. He slipped behind a filing cabinet, invisible in the dim light. Marks and Duran entered, speaking in low tones. They were shaken, though trying to mask it with bravado. Marks muttered about last night and how Klene wasn't pleased with the outcome. Duran spoke of finishing it before the weekend. Chuck's jaw tightened. That meant they were planning one final move, something decisive. He waited until they left, then exhaled slowly, committing their words to memory. The return to the suite was careful, every sense tuned to ensure he wasn't followed. Gina was waiting, her relief visible in the softening of her shoulders when he closed the door behind him. He told her enough to explain the urgency of the next steps, but spared the worst details. She trusted him, and that trust was a weight he carried as carefully as the evidence in his camera. The next morning, Chuck made his move. His friend in federal law enforcement received the files electronically, along with a recorded statement detailing the threats, the pattern of harassment, and the connections to Klene's enterprises. By midday, unmarked vehicles began arriving at the resort, not the kind that drew attention, but the kind that moved with quiet purpose. Agents spread through the property in pairs, their presence almost invisible to the casual observer. But Chuck saw the pattern: methodical, coordinated, a net drawing tighter. When the arrests began, they happened swiftly. Marks and Duran were taken in the staff parking lot, Klene from his private suite overlooking the mountains. There were no shouts, no drawn weapons, just the firm, controlled motions of professionals who knew their quarry had already lost. Guests continued sipping drinks by the pool, mostly unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted. In the aftermath, Chuck was offered the chance to give a statement to the press. He declined. His satisfaction came not from headlines but from the knowledge that the danger was gone, dismantled at its source. Gina understood without words. The twins sensed the release of tension and returned to their playful selves, racing each other down the hallway toward the game room. That evening, they sat together on the balcony as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The air was cool, the sky painted in deep golds and purples. Chuck watched his family, the way Gina's hand rested lightly on the back of Dakota's chair, the way Danilee leaned forward to point out a hawk circling in the distance. These were the moments he fought for, not the battles, not the victories, but the quiet that came after. He thought back to the trap, the confrontation, the chain of events that could have ended so differently. In another life, perhaps he might have left it alone, walked away to preserve peace. But peace bought by fear wasn't peace at all. This way, they could leave the mountains knowing no shadow trailed them, no unseen hand waiting to strike. They would drive away in the morning, down the winding roads to wherever they chose next, and this place would be just another memory, one in which the danger had been met head-on and defeated. As night settled over the resort, Chuck felt the old stillness return, the one that came after a match well fought. The world beyond might still be restless, but here, for now, they were safe, and that was all that mattered. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button now, and turn on the bell so you never miss a twist. Check out the next video for even more shocking stories and explore our other videos packed with moments you won't believe. Share this one with your friends. Let's see their reaction.